There aren't any stars tonight, just the metropolitan fog clouding the sky and my judgment. The night air is cold and biting on my cheeks as if nipping at me for being out so late. Even I know it's way too late to go out, and everything I see seems to confirm this. The lonely moon, the ever-present scent of cigarettes and urine that could only be a bad omen. Every street light stands flickering, as if trying to send me a message. Why are you here? Why are you here? I hunch my shoulders in an attempt to burrow some of the warmth in. I'm wearing your varsity jacket, but it does me no favors against the chill. I keep on walking anyway, towards my beacon, towards you. I'm here because you need me. A man whistles as I walk past, and from behind me I hear even more cajoles and drunken banter. I have to fight the urge to shout an expletive back at them, to wring their necks, to kick them where it hurts, to punch them bloody, to watch the light leave their eyes as easily as how they scare me with their words. But all of that is just born from a frustrated and overworked imagination. To fight back is futile and impossible. I can barely reach the kitchen shelves, and my back hurts from all the freelance coding I do. Add the fact that I am a coward who runs away, at least according to you, then in all accounts, I am weak. Between the two of us, you're the strong one, and you're the one that needs help right now. So I force my legs to move quickly. Few people can make me do this, by the way. I'd do it for Hallie if she didn't want our mother to find out where she was. Maybe for Eliza, if her boyfriend of the month couldn't pick her up, and only if it was nearby. The list ends there. Walking in Manila on a Wednesday night, when old drunk men sing their karaoke while a dead cat lies in the corner of the street. It's scary out here. No woman wants to be outside at a time and place like this. My mother would kill me if she found out I was outside. Even my mild-mannered father would protest. Every instinct, every warning in my body is telling me no, Della. But I keep walking towards the address you texted Lee anyway. I'd be hurt that you just didn't message me directly, but that doesn't matter. I know it's me you wanted to come anyway. Lee is back home, barely moving from exhaustion because he just came home from working a double shift at the hospital. You know that, and yet you still messaged him instead of me. Luckily for you, I was still awake. I was waiting for you to come home. And besides, Lee leaves his things all around the common area. It's why he's the easiest person to steal from. I double-checked to see if you have replied since your last message. You haven't, and so I walk faster. It is strange how the night can heighten every woman's instincts. Any slight movement in the street can be perceived as a threat. Any sudden sound can make my heart start pounding. I don't even want to turn and look if someone is behind me. Shadows creep into the edges of my vision. Cars look menacing, and even the trees look like they want to fight me. A plastic bag rustles and goosebumps crawl on my skin. The only way for me to do this is to keep walking forward. Just ignore everything. The bleak moonlight, the noises of the night, the rabbit-like thumping sound of my heart. I turn a corner. From the distance, I can see the landmark you mentioned, the white drugstore next to the bank. My knees are burning in protest because of the workout I'm putting them through at 1 a.m. You always asked me to go to the gym with you when we were together. You wanted to do so many things together. Running, gardening, visiting your mother, but always in the morning. And that was my problem. I couldn't wake up on time. I could never wake up at the same time as you did so easily. In the morning, you would sneak out of our bed and leave me snoring. At breakfast, you would berate me for not joining you, and I would snarkily reply that you didn't wake me up. To this day, even months after we've broken up, this argument still annoys me. There's still a childish voice in me that wants to ask you, did you even try to wake me up? Or did you just leave without even trying? The thing is, you wanted me to change who I was for you. And I wanted us to stay the same. Things weren't perfect between us, but I thought that's why we worked. We were always changing, from high school friends to college lovers to the weird, in-between stage that we both hated and then to affectionate exes. It was like love was a kaleidoscope, and you and I were just colors changing shapes. It's nice though. I keep knowing different facets of you, and you keep knowing different facets of me. And through it all, we keep staying in each other's orbit. At least, I tried to for you. You kept pushing me away recently, with all the internships you suddenly had, and the changes in your schedule. If you didn't want to see me, you could have just said so. Besides, it was my idea for you to date again, which is why this midnight excursion is even more annoying. We were sitting side by side as you swiped left on every guy. I was insistent about this. I could tell you were hesitant, and were just doing it because I wanted you to do it. I took the initiative. I swiped right for you. I thought this was what we needed to be friends again. Looking at his profile bio and interests, a thought popped into my head. This is the man who can make you laugh. And I was right. He did make you laugh. I saw you giggling in the kitchen when I went downstairs to get a glass of water last week. I started looking for new dormitories at that very moment. I haven't even told you that yet, but I know that you know that the lease is coming up. We only ever stayed in that dorm because Lee's internship in the hospital stressed him out so much that he couldn't possibly deal with finding a new roommate. But Lee is personable and sweet, or so you describe him. Lee only ever leaves me dirty dishes in the sink to clean, which is another reason why we never get along. The fact you took his advice to leave me probably outranks that particular list. He'll probably befriend another college girl to replace me when I leave. I saw you getting ready tonight. You looked very pretty with your pink makeup and your flowy white dress. You even put glittery eyeshadow in the inner corner of your eyes. It's how I knew you were excited for this date. You always put some when we were going out. And when you put on your perfume and waved goodbye at me, my heart did clench a little. It finally felt like it was the end for us. And while it made me sad, it wasn't that hard to watch you leave. There's some comfort in it for me still. I only encouraged you to date men, because if you date another girl after me, I think I'd lose it. I check Lee's phone for the last time as I finally come to a halt in front of a dinky, dark chicken restaurant. I could never understand your interest in finding secret spots across the city, but I loved finding them with you. It just sucks that even that isn't our thing anymore. I put both of my hands on the handle, and the glass door squeaks noisily as I push it open. A server, some teenage boy with dark circles under his eyes, comes up to me, and I ask him if he's seen you. He tells me that you left rushing, your plate still full, when he was in the restroom. Then he ran after you, calling your name. He tells me that you were distraught. He tells me he hasn't seen either of you since. As soon as I read your COS message 30 minutes ago, I knew that something was wrong. Something had to be wrong. But I didn't expect this. My heart plummets to the ground and my body is ice. It feels like my brain is a program that refuses to run because I forgot a parenthesis. Short-circuited haywire. Some part of my brain arrives at what I find to be wrong. You are not the type of person who leaves their dinner. No matter how bad the date, you will finish your meal. You love eating out. It's my favorite fact about you. I go back outside and my fingers tremble as they try to call you. As soon as I hit the dial, I heard Dancing Queen in the tiny alley beside the restaurant. If it wasn't for the streetlight conveniently shining at its entrance, I would have completely missed it. It was the kind of alley you don't want to be in. The kind that hides things in the darkness of the night. You hate those alleys. They scare you. I run to the sound, and there you were, sitting on the ground with the trash and the dust and the broken things all around you, your hands and pretty white dress drenched in blood. There he was, lying on the ground near you, head bashed, limbs folded like a lifeless doll. I numbingly traced the huge splat of blood on the wall. I quickly imagined it, so fast I could have sworn I was there right with you. The dark alley, the man, and you. The dark alley, a strong push from an athlete, and a man. A woman and a man in a dark alley. What did he do to make you push him that hard? A push hard enough to kill. Did you mean to kill him? Or did you just want him to stop? My mind runs in circles, and the question I can't let go remains the same. What did he do to make you push him? There is an equation here that I can't quite figure out. My brain can't seem to process it. I approach you, eyes flitting between the man who is dead and you who is bloodied. Under the bleak moonlight, the broken things, glass, I realize, as I move closer to you, sparkle around you. I wonder if you are hurt, just sitting near the debris. Even though on the ground, they seem to me like stars, and you, the moon. You are incandescent. You are helpless. And I am finally here. You look up, voice barely louder than a whisper, but surer than ever. He looked at me funny. Clouded sunlight filtered into monochromatic foliage. The flowers, pale and unfamiliar, were blanketed in icy crystals. Roger didn't pay them any mind. He always lost time when he looked at them. His arms ached from the weight. A long, thick stretch of living flesh wrapped 4 times around his ribs, one end dangling to his thigh and the other sloping over his shoulder and down to the black dirt. It stretched out into the trail behind him, so long the other end was eaten by the fog. Roger dragged its step by aching step, now used to walking uncomfortably slow. The creature in his arms stopped sleeping days ago. So had he. There was the snap of a cracking branch, and his arms finally gave out. The worm hit the dirt with a deep, sucking gasp. It looked smaller on the ground where mulch stuck to its pulsing skin. Roger knew that it was heavy. Too heavy to move on its own. If he were to pick it up, it would groan and cry with indignation before shutting down again. In his head, Roger could almost hear a bitter voice scoff. Are you just going to stand there? Did you want this to happen to me? It had sounded more critical, since he realized it was watching. Maybe it saw the thought that had lodged itself into his gray matter, time and time again, until he left it. Maybe they watched it dissolve into the steaming sludge that seeped into every waking moment and evaporated in his lungs. The creature must have watched him breathe it in and out, a formless idea Roger barely understood, outside of the fact that it didn't scare him anymore. Maybe it thought the idea should have scared him. Roger's breath tasted bitter and his knees ached, overworked. He could hear his heart pounding sharply below his shoulders and felt it reaching for the base of his throat. He swallowed down, attention pouring outwards. The worm's body rolled lethargically onto one side, as if it could tell what was coming and was smart enough to dread it. It used to be his family. Maybe it still was. But Roger didn't want to pick it up again. His heart beat in his ears, and a stone was in his hand. He couldn't remember when he picked it up, but his muscles ached to accommodate it. It was as heavy as a vital organ, solid under his gloves. His mother's gaze was transfixed on the rock, blown wide and watery like a wild animal. She never liked having brown eyes. She didn't always talk about appearances. She talked about her job, and how she wished she had another, but it came up on the holidays when she'd look in the mirror, or she'd fix his tie and tell him that she was sorry his eyes weren't blue. Not that it mattered anymore, but he assumed some years before all of that, he would have thought that she was beautiful. Now she was something strange and limbless on the ground, eyes bloodshot and empty-looking, a smear across the spongy forest floor. The thing seemed to hear his thoughts and whispered in his mother's voice, "Don't pretend you ever loved me." The last time he ate, it must have been on a Tuesday. Roger remembered how oddly quiet it was when usually his mother would practice piano with his brother. The notes, he can't remember which, were pulled through his ear on a string, clinking together in a headache of a noise. That's why he fell to his knees, body shaking with exertion. The sound turned to a looping white noise of piano keys. Throbbing, scattered, mimicking raindrops or smashed glass. Sleep never lasted when he couldn't feel time pass. His mother took piano lessons on Tuesdays, and she always sang with his brother. The worm's eyes dilated and tethered themselves to his. It wheezed like a human, but its confession was a mumbling sigh. Roger peeled his gloves off and reached for the mammal's head. It was soft, warm. It pushed itself firmly into his palm, like it was trying to change his mind about the whole thing, and the skin rose between his fingers as he held it firmly to the ground. The shudder of his stomach could have been from the cold or from disgust. He looked away from the eyes that were always miserable. He told it, "Please lie still." It opened its mouth, and he struck it in the side. The body was softer than he thought it'd be. It jerked and coiled, breaking ice and mud with a shout. He hit it again. Again. The sound was padded and dull, fleshy and strange. There was a shudder that engulfed the endless length of the spineless body. Roger's stomach flipped at the sight of red foam, and when he hit it one more time with a yawning sense of dread, his hand was empty. Roger patted down his pockets for the rock. Where did he put it? He couldn't remember the last thing he ate, and he was too scared to look if the body was still moving. If he failed to kill it, if he wanted to kill it, he wouldn't be able to accept another stone. The one he had was his. His eyes burned. His throat hurt. He could only imagine his mother scoffing again, and that long, blank look she'd give the mirror. He'd open the door and head for the room she still had for him, and the notes from the piano would drag to a stop as he passed. He'd have to stand where he was, and then she was always going to tell him for the rest of his life, "I know you think I'm better off dead." Roger didn't. He didn't think that. If he did, he didn't believe it. It's cold outside. When did he last eat? He was suddenly back on the ground, and the leaves above were all gray and dead. The flowers weren't like anything he could name, but they sparkled with dew or ice. Wet and leering like eyes. His body shuddered, and he remembered it was freezing. Roger was never able to sleep in the cold. He blinked or blacked out, and there was only the sound of whispered, weeping sobs. Tears were soaking into his coat. Frost crawled along the wool. There was breathing by his head, and a weight on his chest, and the thing was back. It always wanted to look at him while it changed its face. She always wanted him to know exactly how much pain she was in, and how stupid he was. Roger watched but covered his ears. He did feel stupid. Its eyes bulged and the neck began to swell. Every notable piece of anatomy was sucked down into the rest of the length. Face left as a fleshy, shapeless blob. The teeth went missing, mouth a limp flap of skin. Loose sockets and a tube of a mouth stared hauntingly blank at Roger, until a second skull rotated with the first, and the skin began to fill again. New eyes poked out with a pop. New teeth grew in with a soft, breathy sigh. Roger's stomach churned when the hair grew out in a puff of black fuzz. It dropped on his chest, stuttering his lungs, and the skin contracted and wrinkled his clothes. Ducky couldn't speak anymore, but in the mornings, when his brother would shuffle up close, Roger would notice that his face still had dimpled cheeks and small, gappy teeth that whistled. He'd pop his spit bubbles on the front of Roger's coat when they walked, and laugh when Roger would flick his forehead. All the while, Roger would imagine finding napkins in the woods and being clean. The sound of Ducky's crying was hardly different from the time he broke his finger in the door hinge. Breath feeling all too thin, Roger held his brother's skull in his palms, gently rocking back and forth. His fingers shook as he dragged them through his hair. The worm was dripping drool on Roger's coat when it stopped crying. Roger smiled up at his brother, cold and numb. The creature was climbing up his leg, so he stood still and let it, though he didn't remember getting to his feet. It slithered over a bruise it had given him on Tuesday, when the piano had been silent, but he didn't remember getting that either. Then, it wrapped its neck around Roger's, and hung its head, so its chin laid against his chest. Its belly breathed against his back, and blood dribbled from its neck onto his throat. The pressure was everywhere, pulse pushing into his skin. He gagged on saliva, but held still as his family lifted its head and nestled beneath his scarf. Skin briefly pressed flush to his neck before the bulk settled further over his back. Warm expiration crawled into his hat and turned stale in his hair. He closed his lips and looked up at the trees. His fingers ached at the memory of the rock. His ears held onto the sound it had made. He was briefly terrified by the notion of tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, the piano stopping when he would open the door, an empty skin stretched into a black, emotionless smile. But the trees, he realized belatedly, were moving towards him. His legs were pushing forward. The flowers looked like edelweiss. Roger bundled his family more tightly in his arms and imagined himself resting on the beaten leather couch in their parlor, back home. Ducky would be spitting bubbles, and their mother would be brewing coffee, and Roger was always going to hold their hands and tell them, "You'll be okay." It was hard to breathe. It was very hard to breathe. Without the stone sitting in his pocket, he thought he'd float into the flowers. I was an only child. No siblings for me. Except for my sister, who lived in the drainage culvert behind the house where I grew up. The drainage culvert wasn't much more than a giant, concrete-lined ditch at the base of the hill where my childhood home was built. Growing up in Southern California, the ground was so parched and dry that the first rain of the year didn't do much more than run off the hard-packed dirt. Not that there was much dirt available to absorb what rain did fall. My neighborhood was all asphalt and stucco. Water bounced off the landscape like lice off a hot skillet. The culvert collected all that water and flushed it through a tunnel to the nearest river, which always went from a sad trickle most of the year to a swollen, churning monster after the rain. People died fairly regularly when they were camping or walking by the river, not realizing how fast the floodwaters could fill the ravine when a storm blew through. I remember a child at my elementary school died in one of the floods. We had a school-wide assembly, and they brought in counselors. The boy who died was in a different grade than me, and I didn't really know him, so it didn't affect me much. I remember being much more upset when the family dog died that same year. Maybe that makes me a bad person, but in my defense, I was still very young, and I was probably a little self-centered from being an only child. Except for my sister in the culvert. My sister was what you would probably call an imaginary friend. We would have conversations, and she knew all the people I knew and agreed with all my most adamant opinions, such as which Goosebumps books were the best, and that McDonald's had superior French fries to Burger King. The important things. I only spoke to her down by the culvert, though. She wouldn't come visit me elsewhere. I was deeply fascinated by the culvert. It was the closest thing to a natural wilderness that I had access to at the time, and I would often launch little expeditions down there to explore and see my sister. Crawdads lived in the pathetic stream of green water that always flowed at the bottom of the culvert, waving their claws in agitation whenever I approached. A pack of coyotes visited the culvert sometimes, always eating a few neighborhood cats before moving on. The culvert was hardly my little secret. I'd frequently find fresh glass from broken beer bottles, blackened stubs of illegal fireworks, and the butts of purloined cigarettes amid the sunburnt chaparral and cat bones, evidence that older kids had snuck down the denuded hill and partied. One time after a storm, I found a hopelessly rusted pocket knife that I naturally deduced had belonged to the sewer pirates that surely lived in the tunnel at the end of the concrete channel. But there was one place I truly believed only I knew about, and that was where my sister lived. A gravel trail ran beside the culvert, allowing anyone to look down into the trough as if they were walking along the precipice to a small canyon. At a bend in the culvert, where the ridge of the hill hid the closest houses, and it was easiest for me to believe I was exploring uncharted lands, perhaps wielding a stick as a sword, there was a dead, toppled-over willow tree. The tree's branches, which had all turned gray with age and sunlight, lay in a sort of broken mound. It looked a bit like a cartoon haystack, except it was the color of bone. But there was something under the mound. An old playhouse. In my young mind, it must have been a century old, but it had probably only been there for a couple of decades at most. Unlike every other child's playhouse I had seen, this one was made of wood rather than plastic. That alone almost made it feel like some artifact from a different era. Before it was crushed by the fallen willow, the house had probably been a roughly 4-foot by 4-foot cube, big enough for a small child to sit inside with a few treasured toys. The walls were made of horizontal slats with a little door and window. When it was brand new, it would have looked like a little pink cottage. Now, most of the paint had peeled away, and what remained had faded to an exhausted-looking shade of pale mauve. The roof had been crushed under the tree, and the whole house sat crooked. You had to duck under the bleached boughs of the willow to find what remained of the house, probably snapping a few of the arthritically brittle branches as you pushed your way forward. An adult never would have seen it while walking along the trail. I never went in what remained of the little house. For one thing, the interior was so thick with spider webs that it always looked like there was some sort of ragged, dusty mist trying to inch its way out of the structure. I'd always peek through the window, though, looking down at the mysteries that lay within. An off-brand Barbie doll, mostly hidden by the cobwebs. A patchwork of different colored fur clumps, presumably detritus from many, many long-devoured cats. And a bit of tattered tarp sticking up out of the dirt, which always seemed to wave tantalizingly in the breeze. But also, my sister was always far too insistent that I go inside the house. Left to my own devices, maybe I would have eventually worked up the nerve to duck inside the splintered doorway, to claim a souvenir or see what was buried in that tarp. But I never liked being told what to do. And the more she told me to step inside, the less I wanted to. But I always came back, always drawn to that small, shattered house that I alone seemed to know about. Even at the time, I knew it was silly to call the voice I spoke to my sister. I called her that because she liked it, and because she knew my name and all about the house where I lived. She knew about the weird wallpaper in the bathroom that my mother hated but never worked up the willpower to remove. She knew about that jacaranda tree outside the kitchen window that always got seed pods everywhere. She knew about the neighbor who was a longtime elementary school principal and his 4 daughters. Though my sister said the neighbor only had one daughter, just an infant, when she knew him. Those shared experiences were what I always imagined it would be like to have a sibling. To be clear, I never saw my sister. I would simply hear her voice. We would play a game where I would try to find her. Usually, she tried to lead me into the playhouse, but I would always say that I could see inside and knew she wasn't in there. She would go silent, pouting for a while. Sometimes she would tell me to leave her alone if I didn't want to play properly, and I would go home. But especially if it had rained recently and the water was high in the culvert, I would hear her voice from near the edge of the turbulent water instead of the playhouse. When I heard the voice from the water, I would usually go sit by the edge of the culvert. I always had to lean forward to hear what my sister was saying when we were so close to the seething water. Most of the time, I could only pick out her tone and not exact words. Pleading sometimes. Petulant other times. Saccharine, sweet or insistent and bossy, depending on her mood and how cooperative I was feeling that day. I would sit and watch the water shoot into the drainage tunnel at the end of the culvert, surging with shocking force after a good rain. I wanted to find my sister. I wanted to go to her. I didn't necessarily realize it at the time, at least not in these terms, but I was often lonely without any siblings. I was shy and not very social and had trouble making friends. So it was so very enticing to hear someone asking me to jump in the water with them, or to climb into the crooked playhouse and join them. It was why I kept coming back, even though I didn't want to do those things. I think being an only child made me stubborn too, though. Or perhaps just a bit spoiled. I was used to getting my way. I was more than capable of ignoring my parents' attempts to convince me to eat my vegetables. And I'm sure I was a holy terror for some of my teachers to deal with when I was being a brat. But I had willpower to spare, so I never climbed into the shattered playhouse. And I never splashed into the rushing water to greet the shape I thought I could make out under the murk, no matter how the voice implored me, begged me, cajoled, threatened. Today, it seems strange that I wasn't more incredulous about just how insistent my imaginary sister could be. I was young, and it was just one of hundreds of phenomena that I was aware of, but didn't understand. The impending threat of Y2K cow. The stock market. Monica Lewinsky. The voice from the broken playhouse. All beyond my comprehension and not worth asking additional questions about. They simply were. I was upset when my parents told me that we were moving. My father's work had promoted him to some sort of regional manager position, albeit in a different region. I had a few friends. I had a favorite teacher. I had my sister to think of. We moved back to Southern California a few years later, after another promotion, but to a different city in the same region. Aside from a few hazy memories, I mostly forgot about my sister. I made new friends. Some of the great, unanswerable questions of my childhood became distinctly more answerable as I progressed through school and moved away to college. When I thought about my sister at all, she was one of those curious memories of a child with an active imagination, relegated to the dustbin of memory, along with the monsters in my closet and comic book, characters I imagined I'd write about someday. My mom still lives in the area. I visited her a few months ago. As a matter of fact, before I caught my flight back, I made a little pit stop by my childhood home. I wanted to see what I remembered and to snap a photo of the old house to show my wife. I also walked down to the culvert. It hasn't changed much, though I didn't see any cat bones. I also didn't see the fallen willow tree or any signs of a smashed child's playhouse. At the time, part of me wondered if I hadn't made up the playhouse just like I made up my sister. I didn't even mention the culvert to my wife when I went home, though she has heard the story about my imaginary sister before. I would have forgotten all about it, except my mom recently sent me a picture. She had gone to console a longtime friend whose grandson had recently passed away in an accident, drowned after being swept away following a severe rainstorm. A senseless tragedy, obviously. Except the picture she sent me was of the grandson's backyard, where part of the memorial service was held. They had a wooden playhouse in the backyard. It was old, built like a little cottage, with horizontal slats and a window and door. It had been repainted and repaired at some point, but I still recognized it. I've looked up some old news articles from my hometown. There have been so many drownings. A statistically unlikely number. Mostly children. So far as I can tell, most of them had siblings. Maybe that's important. Maybe it isn't. The restored playhouse has been bothering me. I can't prove it's the same one I saw all those years ago. It seems unlikely that anyone would repair the old thing. But the one that I saw in the picture sat a little crooked in its frame. And you can tell some of the boards are newer than others. In the end, it doesn't look so much repaired as healed, like an abused dog that's been rescued and finally eating regularly. I called my mom up not long after she sent the picture, trying to be as nonchalant as I could. I asked her if she knew anything about the playhouse. She told me that the family had sold it since it was now associated with too many sad memories. Some nice couple with a pair of sons had bought it, and they actually lived a short distance from where I'd grown up. Their house even backed up to the hill where the culvert lay. My attorney has asked me to explain what I was doing in that family's backyard that night with an axe. She told me that I'm lucky I was only charged with trespassing and property destruction. Not even a serious property destruction charge, since the damage to the playhouse was much less than the police originally believed. I thought I had smashed the thing to kindling, but apparently not. The police investigation into my case took a back seat after one of the boys who lives at that house disappeared. They didn't even get around to photographing the damaged house, mostly intact, until after the boy's body was fished out of the drainage tunnel, his lungs filled with silty water. They even looked at me as a suspect at one point, but I had an ironclad alibi. And besides, the surviving brother insists that it was their imaginary friend who convinced them to play down by the water that day. Next time I'll try arson. My attorney wouldn't like that I'm writing this part down, but she's only supposed to release this if they find me in the water. One way or another, I intend to stop my sister. She keeps making only children, but I can make myself an only child again, too. My sister has always had a soft heart. Soft as sweet bread. She cried after the old woman despite everything. Maybe because of everything. I remember holding her as she wept, both of us covered in soot, her fingers scalded from holding shut the oven door. After the tears, she was quiet. She trailed me through the awful house with its sweetbread walls and sugared windows. I found the clothes we'd arrived in, offered up her kirtle, and she donned it without a word. She showed no whisper of response when we found the treasure in the attic, only nodded vaguely when I asked her to help me fill up the few bags we could easily carry back through the woods. Maybe it would be enough. Enough to keep us safe from our stepmother's whims. I do not want to go back there. It was the first she'd spoken in hours. I hesitated outside the witch's cottage, looking back over my shoulder at her. I do not want to go back to them. I sighed. Nor do I, but where else can we go? She wrung her fingers together in front of her skirt, eyes downcast and her teeth digging into her lower lip. Eventually, though, she nodded. Fine, you are right. She looked back at the house. Wait 1 minute. There may be something left in the kitchen. The kitchen? I repeated in horror, but she only nodded. Yes, she did not think I paid attention, but I did. I know which of her potions might be useful. If nothing else, we can sell them when we get back. I nodded slowly and followed her back into the cottage, though I stopped in the open arch that led into the kitchen itself. She moved easily, though the space reminding me painfully of just how long she had been under the witch's thumb, while the horrid crone tried to fatten me like a prize hog. She collected some dozen bottles and vials, tucking them carefully in between the bolts of silks and satins we had pilfered from the attic before returning to me. Let us go. Though there was no trail this time, she seemed to know her way through the trees. I asked how once, when we paused to wait out the dark, but all she said was that she simply knew now, as though the forest spoke to her in a way it hadn't before. I felt the first thrill of fear at that, but I knew that she was still so scared herself. I refused to let her see it. I tried to coax her into dreaming about what sort of life we might have with the witch's pilfered treasure, and managed to earn a wan smile for my efforts. But it was cold and dark, and soon enough we simply huddled together under a gnarled tree as we waited for the deepest part of night to pass. When grayish dawnlight began to filter through the leaves, she was the first to stand. She had gone quiet again, and only answered me with faint hums or single words as we continued on our way. She seemed more comfortable to be leading us now, but something in the set of her shoulders reminded me of something I could not quite name. Eventually I lapsed into her silence. When the trees broke apart to reveal the familiar shape of our father's home, she froze. Then she broke into a run, and I was only half a step behind her. The door was already opening when we reached the stoop, and our father met us with his arms open and tears in his eyes. He held us close and apologized, over and over, praising the Lord's name. I embraced him in turn, but alongside the relief in my chest, there was an anger in my gut. It had started a spark, but over the length of our trek back through the woods had grown into a steady flame. I met my sister's eyes over our father's shoulder, and a chill ran through me. If my anger was a flame, then hers was the dead cold of darkest winter. Our father explained that our stepmother had been stricken ill not long after we left. She was in her room now, asleep, and had been for days. He did not expect her to recover, though he had been following the physician's orders as best he could. Perhaps she shall rally to see you, he offered us hopefully. When neither of us answered, he sighed and dragged a hand down his thick beard. There was more gray in it than I remembered. I know you must be angry with me, with us, he told us wretchedly. That I could lose track of you so easily. It is an unforgivable failing in a father. Los. I started slightly at the sharp edge in my sister's voice. Our father did too. She had always had a soft voice to match her heart. We were lost, she repeated, staring at him intently. Our father stared back, eyes wide with a hint of fear. Lost, he confirmed at last in little more than a whisper. I dropped my eyes, unable to continue looking at him. My sister did not. Abruptly, she stood from our small table. We will go see her then. I blinked, startled both by the sudden movement and the conviction in her voice, but I followed her into our stepmother's sick room. That flame of rage flickered a little higher in my chest, and I found that I could not make myself move more than 2 steps inside the door. My sister knelt beside the hateful woman, and smoothed a hand over her brow in a gesture so tender, it made me want to break something. Here. She tipped one of the witch's vials against her lips. This will help. I almost reached out to stop her, but as though she sensed the movement, she held a staying hand back toward me. When the vial was empty, she stood and brushed her hands down the front of her skirt. She did not look at me as she left the room. I hesitated a moment longer behind her, staring at the woman who had left us to the wood and the wild. Already, her breathing seemed easier. Anger and love for my sister warred, twin flames in the center of my chest. She had always borne such a soft heart. Our stepmother was awake and lively within a day. Though shocked by our return, she was mollified enough by the offerings of treasure we had stolen away with that. She simpered, and even summoned up some mawkish tears, through which to tell us she was so sorry we had been lost to the wood. My rage burned hotter, and my sister grew colder. "We should celebrate your return," our stepmother exclaimed, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, but no other sign of her illness remaining. "What do you wish for supper, my darlings?" "Sweet bread." I jerked around to stare at my sister, eyes wide and mouth agape. She did not so much as glance at me, but I felt her hand take mine under the table. She smiled at our stepmother, and my throat went dry. "But you are still recovering, stepmother." "I feel quite well, all things considered." "I shall make it," she offered gently. I could have stopped her then, could have clutched her hand in mine and dragged us out. We could have taken the treasure and left. It had been foolish of me to think there was nowhere for us to go. We might go anywhere. Seeing our father again, hearing him refuse to admit what they had done, made me sure of that. But my sister looked at me, just for a moment, and the ice in her gaze froze me to my chair. She was not looking for permission, but I nodded shakily anyway. Our stepmother exclaimed what a good, kind girl she was as she moved into the kitchen. Soon enough, the cloying smell of the baking sweetbread hung thick in the air. It was all I could do not to gag. My sister served the plates while the bread was still steaming gently, even drizzling the last of our honey stores over our parents' portions. "We can always get more at the market now," she said with a hollow little laugh. Our stepmother agreed happily, though our father hesitated a moment before doing so himself. He was watching my sister with a faint wariness as she took her seat beside me. "Go on then. Let us eat." They did. We sat in silence. It took our stepmother first. A faint cough, a furrow in her brow. She looked up with confusion, which changed quickly to a horrified realization as she stared at my sister. "You!" Our father choked, red spattering his lips. I looked away, squeezing my sister's hand tight where she had once more taken it beneath the table. We were desperate," he strangled out, reaching for her pleadingly. "I did not want to. She made me." My sister shook her head. "You let her." He collapsed forward onto the table, his breath a wheezing rattle that grew fainter with each passing moment. Our stepmother tried to lunge for us, but her legs gave out, and she sprawled across the floor. A scarlet trail, like candied jam, trickled from the corner of her mouth. "You," she gasped again, glaring balefully up at my sister. "You little witch." They both began to convulse. I buried my face in my sister's shoulder. I could feel her stroking my hair, even without raising my head. I knew she did not look away until their last breaths had faded into silence. Then she simply stood, her hand still in mine. We were both silent as we gathered up our bags, still unpacked by the front door, and stepped out into the cool evening. "You are afraid." I swallowed. "Yes." She smiled at me, squeezed my hand again, and all I felt was cold. "You do not need to be. I will protect you." My sister has always had a soft heart. Soft as poisoned sweetbread. The dream saturated her entire being. She could smell the dirt walls of the basement where two boys were kept bound together, until the smaller one died of starvation. She could see the bright red fabric on the Chinese dragon twisting and twirling gracefully against the clear blue sky, like a ballet, as it carried explosives towards a boat full of people. She could hear a mother's lament, wailing in despair, looking on the bodies of her 8 dead children in the countryside, next to a babbling brook. All the dreams had one thing in common: death. Each telling held a soul claimed by the darkness. The dreams were stories told by the dead, the history of those murdered. Her name was Elizabeth Stride. She was a dream seer. Some thought she had a morbid curiosity. The truth was the morbid had a curiosity with her. It started when she was 13. She would wake in the middle of the night screaming, out of breath, in a cold sweat. Night terrors, the doctors called it. The doctors didn't know, and probably wouldn't have believed her if she told them that during these night terrors she saw things. Like a movie reel was playing in her head. Except the characters in the movies knew she was watching them. They were watching her too. There were things they wanted her to know. 20 years after she started seeing, she remembered every dream, every story. Hundreds of them banging around inside her mind, nagging at her, begging to come out, leaking through the seams of her existence. Terrifying memories imprinted on her. Elizabeth felt the emotions of the dream tellers. She had always thought of the owners of the dreams as the tellers, and she was the seer. Her job was to see and hear them without judgment. While the tellers scared her, at least at first, she came to care for them. One fall evening, Elizabeth was sitting on the dock of her home on Lake Rusiger, an hour north of Seattle. She loved the bright red of the fall leaves surrounding the lake. The water was dark. The sound of it splashing against the wood comforted her. A heavy fog moved in with the night sky settling over the lake like a blanket, leaving the stars above to provide pinpricks of light across the water. The scenery brought back feelings and memories that did not belong to her. There was a dream that played in her head over and over for 15 years, like it happened yesterday. The lake carried her back to that dream. The dream wouldn't let go of her. It was obsessed with telling her. It had to tell her, and she had to get it out of her head, out where others could know it. The dead wanted to be heard. This dream teller was very loud and persistent. It was this story Elizabeth decided she had to write down. The teller's soul would not rest until the story was witnessed. Elizabeth walked back to her cozy 2-bedroom house and put on a teapot. She pulled her leather chair out from her teak writing desk and sat down in front of a laptop. A hand-knit throw blanket lay across the back of her chair, which she wrapped herself in. Then she started typing. The words came out like machine gun fire, faster than she could type them. Quickly, she recounted each scene of the dream as it played out inside her head like a film playing in front of her. The teapot started to whistle. Elizabeth tried to pull away to go to the kitchen. She wanted to stop the noise, but she was driven to sit back down. She had to type. She had to get it out. With the angry tea kettle screaming in the background, Elizabeth wrote. The dream teller was a 16-year-old girl with blonde hair and a beautiful smile. The year was 1967. The story starts at night, a black sky filled with a moon that glowed like a lighthouse warning ships to keep away from the shore. Warm summer air carried a fevered breeze, the sound of crickets playing a symphony in the background. 2 cars were joyriding down a narrow dirt road. A wheat field was on the right side, and a row of tall green trees far behind it. The car in the lead was a red convertible Mustang. The top down, windows open. The dream teller rode in the passenger seat of the Mustang with her hand stretched out the right side, brushing against the wheat as it blew and rustled. Next to her was a dark-haired boy with a red and white football jacket. He was whooping and hollering, excited noises. The car behind them carried a group of boisterous teens laughing and yelling. They were all together, drinking and partying. Both cars drove to the end of the wheat field and took a hard right towards the Folsom Lake boat launch. A large white 1960 motor yacht greeted them, glowing with light like a swarm of fireflies inside the belly of a monster floating on the lake. The teenagers loaded their belongings onto the boat. As the teller walked along the side deck of the boat towards the warmly lit door of the cabin, she was bright-eyed, smiling, immersed in conversation with another girl in the party. It was getting late. The temperature dropped, putting a chill in the air. Thick fog quietly crept over the lake. Finally, the boat left the dock. The teller was with the dark-haired boy in the football jacket. They were standing together on the deck as the boat motored further onto the lake. He was behind her with his arms around her waist. She leaned back into him. Her head was laying against his chest. Her eyes closed, her lips turned up in the corners, not so much a slight smile as contentment. The next scene showed the teller alone, immersed in the cold water of the lake, surrounded by the thick, dense fog. The frigid water against her skin. It felt like ice in her veins. The lake was silent except for the lapping of the waves. The teller was face down, unconscious, her body bobbing up and down with the rhythm of the current. Her blonde hair was completely soaked. Suddenly, the teller pulled her head out of the water, gasping for air. She looked around, her eyes wide in disbelief, mascara running down her cheeks. She started to cry. Then she started to sob in anguish, hysteria coursing through her. "How did I get here? They left me," she whispered into the silent lake. The teller looked around the lake and could see the warm lights on houses off in the distance through the curtain of fog, but she couldn't swim to them. She couldn't move towards them. She was frozen where she was. For 10 years, the teller never left that spot. In Folsom Lake, in the cold, confused, and surrounded by mist, as though that night never ended. She relived her own wretched fate over and over. This story replayed in the seer's mind from the very beginning in the car beside the wheat field, up to this moment with the teller in the water. The seer did not communicate to the teller that she was dead. That was not the role of the seer. The seer could speak to the dead, but she did so with caution. The seer was only to observe and make sure the teller felt hurt. The teller had to become aware of what had befallen her in her own time. One day, the dream revealed more. Still in the lake, the teller started to remember that night on the yacht. With a deafening panic, she saw herself falling into the water, her lungs filling, her nose and mouth covered. No air was allowed entry. The pain in her chest as her lungs burst and heart stopped. With a sickening blow of horror, she understood that she was dead. For another 5 years, the teller remained in the freezing lake, enveloped in fog, grieving her own death. A ringing took over inside her mind. It was all she could hear. She could no longer listen to the waves lapping around her, just the ringing. The blindfold was being removed. Soon she would be able to see more. The seer started to feel a tremendous anger, but it was not her anger. It was the teller's anger. The seer understood the teller knew someone murdered her. Like a veil that lifted, the teller would become aware of what she was ready to know, but she did not know everything. Not just yet. There was something just beyond the teller's grasp of memory. She almost knew who did this to her, but she could not quite see it. The last thing the teller saw was going into the water with such force that she hit her head against the side of the boat before her body met the water. The teller became more and more agitated. She was angry, fiercely angry at having her life stolen from her. Now this was the dream seer's only thought, falling into the water and feeling sheer despair. A bloody body left in the waves. Elizabeth broke away from her writing session, her head pounding from the noisy kettle. She wanted to relieve the dream teller of her anger. She poured out the poor drowned soul's sadness onto paper, convinced it would let the teller find peace. After 15 years, Elizabeth knew the pain of the teller's story. She felt The teller was just a character in a story as far as anyone else was concerned. But Elizabeth knew the teller was real. Elizabeth breathed life into the teller's soul with each typed word, slowly unleashing a power that she was unaware she possessed. The universe sparked and buzzed with energy, flickering like atoms tightly packed together, vibrating to create a solid entity. The teller and the seer's energy was drawn together, with an explosive outcome. The teller became strong enough to be seen. She no longer lived only in the seer's memory. The teller became a spirit manifested into existence in the physical world, but she was not fully who she was before. She was not a sweet 16-year-old girl, beautiful and full of hope, as Elizabeth had seen her over and over again for 15 years. The teller's murder had consumed her hope and replaced it with vengeance. Trapped in a bleak haze of white, wet, and alone, she was starved of the opportunities life once offered. Her mind became distorted, her appearance transformed. Once glowing bronze skin turned white and wrinkled. Bouncy blonde hair was now gray and thin. Her stunning blue eyes turned black, haunted, and deranged. A day passed. Elizabeth thought about her writing session the night before. She sat down for a movie with a large glass of wine, wrapped up in a soft blanket. The wind whipped outside, cracking branches against the side of the house. Rain pelted the roof, which she found a comforting sound between the crackling of the fireplace. Elizabeth could not focus on the movie, and the wine did not numb her as usual. She thought after writing the teller's story she too would feel some relief. Instead, she felt something else. She could not quite put her finger on it. An ill omen was in the air. At bedtime she turned on her tabletop waterfall fountain. White noise. The sound of the water dripping over the rocks melted her down deep into her bed. The light from her phone charger reflected the movement from the fountain onto the ceiling like blue waves above her head, dancing like water on the ceiling as though she was blissfully at the bottom of the sea with no emotional connection to the world. She fell into a deep sleep. At 3:00 a.m., as with most nights, Elizabeth awoke after receiving a dream from a teller who was just a child. "Hurry, Mom." Those were the dreams that left her exhausted, obsessively thinking about their story. Faintly, Elizabeth could hear water dripping. It was not the water from her tabletop fountain. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen. Leaving the warmth of her down comforter, she slid into her robe and slippers. She had probably left the faucet on just enough to allow a small leak to occur, she thought. Elizabeth walked through the house, barely able to see. The sky was dark outside, providing no moonlight. The bulb under the microwave had burned out. She forgot to replace it. That was the light she normally left on as a nightlight in the house. She stumbled, putting her hands out, feeling for the wall where the light switch lived. Elizabeth walked several paces when she felt something wet under her foot. Some type of liquid was on the carpet, soaking through her slipper. She cringed, suddenly smelling a scent like vinegar. "What is going on?" she said to herself, waving her arms out in front of her, searching for a way to light the room. She tripped over something and fell over forward, landing on top of something large, flaccid, and slightly warm. Whatever it wasn't moving or making any sound. Repulsed, she pulled her body away. "Holy shit! Oh my God, Elizabeth cried out. "Is that an animal?" she wondered, now on her feet and frantically searching for the light switch. How would an animal get inside her house? Finally, the hard plastic switch appeared beneath her fingers. Flipping it on with urgency, she turned to look behind her, and she cried out, a blood-curdling scream. On her dining room floor lay a bloated man. His skin was gray, and his head and neck were covered in blood. His still body showed no sign of breath. The floor around him was covered in blood and water. There was a note on top of him. Seer, a gift for you. Next time you dream, I'll show you. The girl in the lake. No, this can't be. Elizabeth mumbled. Elizabeth took the note and put it in a drawer and called the police. It was a frenzied night with police all over the inside of her home. A detective took her statement and provided her the information that the 73-year-old man found bludgeoned to death in her home was David Johnson, a real estate broker from California. He was soaked in water. The forensic lab was testing it. Elizabeth had a feeling she knew what type of water it was. The police didn't find any evidence that Elizabeth knew him. They took DNA samples, both hers and the victim's. She was aware the police would remain curious about her until another explanation surfaced. She prayed one would come to light, since no one would believe a spirit did this. Elizabeth left for a hotel, carrying a bottle of Xanax in her purse. Cleaners were scheduled to come into her house in the morning, and she couldn't be there until they were done. Once safely in her room, she chased a Xanax down with a glass of wine. It was already 3 a.m. She had to try and get some sleep. That next morning, Elizabeth sat straight up in bed at 6 a.m. The teller, the girl in the lake, had come to her. Elizabeth got her laptop and started writing furiously. After a night of drinking and fun with friends, the teller was with the boy in the red and white football jacket on the deck of the boat in the middle of Folsom Lake. The teller turned to the dark-haired boy and said, "I have some news for you." "What could you possibly want to tell me? Does it have anything to do with that cheerleading uniform you brought with you?" he asked, smiling. "Actually, this is a bit hard to say, but I'm pregnant," the teller said. The dark-haired boy backed away from her. He looked like he'd just been slapped. His mouth open and his brows furrowed. "I'm going to college, I told you that. You're going to have to get rid of it," he said, telling her, not asking her. "I can't do that. I thought you'd be happy, at least not this upset," the teller said. The argument led to pushing and shoving. He was furious. She was ruining his life. She was hurt that he would leave her to take care of the situation on her own. The dark-haired boy suddenly grabbed her and threw her violently over the side of the boat. He could see her face down with blood coming off her head as the yacht motored away. The dark-haired boy's name was David Johnson. Then Elizabeth took pause. Her fingers did not want to stop typing, but she willed them to. It was imperative that she corrected the ending of this story to capture the soul she unleashed. She typed, "That spot in Folsom Lake is where the teller would stay for the rest of her days, floating in a sea of her own rage. The lake would forever be haunted by this desolate soul, with no hope of escaping her fate." The energy in the universe looped back, sparking a disconnection from the seer's energy and the teller's, the girl in the lake. The teller would no longer be strong enough to remain in the physical world, and the seer made it so. That night, Elizabeth slept soundly until 3 a.m. In her dreams came a dark-haired boy in a red and white football jacket. "Hello, seer," he smiled.